You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Nathaniel Barber, he's a son of liberty, and his family Bible is amazing. He writes about his wife dying because the British, during the occupation of Boston, they're leaving Boston. She's sick and she dies very soon after. And he says, it's them. They killed my wife. But the two of them also have these children that they name little Oliver Cromwell Barber and Catherine Macaulay Barber and John Wilkes Barber. Like, they are really political. And that family Bible is amazing as a revolution-centric document.
Hello, and welcome to episode 416 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Have you ever wondered why genealogy captivates so many people? Whether it's tracing a family tree back generations or holding on to stories told around the dinner table, genealogy offers a powerful sense of connection, a connection that can shape identities, claims of property, and even arguments for freedom. But genealogy isn't just a modern-day hobby. In early America, genealogy was a deeply consequential practice with social, political, and legal implications. Karen Wolf, a professor of history and the 8th director and librarian of the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University, joins us with details from her new book, Lineage, Genealogy and the Power of Connection in Early America. She joins us to help us explore the ways that early Americans kept and traced their family trees and why they were so interested in creating family histories. Now, during our exploration, Karen reveals how early Americans understood and practiced genealogy, including vernacular genealogy and oral traditions, the role genealogy played in shaping early American ideas about family, freedom, and authority, and why genealogy mattered across lines of race, class, and gender in a society that was increasingly organized around patriarchal and legal structures. But first, I have some exciting news about Ben Franklin's World. We're entering a brand new chapter, and we'd love for you to be a part of it. Ben Franklin's World is now a production of Clio Digital Media, a 501c3 nonprofit organization that I co-founded with Joe Edelman and Karen Wolf. This move takes us back to our independent roots, which means we have full editorial control over the stories we share and the history we explore. Now, what does this move mean for you? It means that you can continue to trust that every episode brings you a complete, nuanced, and historically accurate picture of vast early America, free from any outside influence or organizational constraints. It also means that we really need your support. Producing Ben Franklin's World takes a lot of time, resources, and care, and we've been doing it without any sort of help since February 2025. In fact, Tim and I have been covering the show's production costs since February. And with fewer grants available, we really need to rely on you, our community, to help keep this show going. Now, the good news, because Clio Digital Media is a nonprofit organization, your donations are tax deductible. So whether you give monthly or just one time, your support helps us produce more great episodes, host community discussions, and maintain our listener-first mission. So please help us write this new chapter. Donate today at benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. Thank you so much for your consideration and for being a part of Ben Franklin's World. Okay, one more short announcement before we dive into our conversation. I first met Karen Wolf at a history conference in 2007, back when I was deep in the trenches of graduate school. In 2012, I heard her deliver a passionate talk about the importance of writing book reviews and how book reviews shape both scholarship and the business side of history. That talk really stuck with me. So when this podcast began to grow exponentially in 2015, and I needed guidance on the behind-the-scenes world of history publishing, I reached out. Karen and I quickly became friends and collaborators, primarily through our work on the Omohundro Institute's Doing History series, which is also when I came to know Joe Edelman. The three of us found a natural connection and bonded by a shared commitment to public history, digital media, and great storytelling. All of which is to say, Joe and I are thrilled to welcome our friend, mentor, and colleague Karen Wolf to this show. And in the interest of complete transparency, we're not just admirers of Karen's work, we're also close collaborators. So with that, let's dive into our exploration of genealogy and the power of connection in early America. Our guest is a professor of history and the 8th director and librarian of the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University. She's a co-founder of Clio Digital Media, the nonprofit organization where we now produce Ben Franklin's World. Her research expertise is in how gender and family intersect with political ideas, practices, and structures in early British America. And you may remember our guest from episode 114, where we discussed the early American history of genealogy. Today, she joins us to offer an updated version of that conversation with details from her new, completed book, Lineage, Genealogy and the Power of Connection in Early America. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Karen Wolf.
Thank you, Liz. I'm so happy to be here. I was reflecting on that first episode and thinking, gosh, should I listen to it again? But I didn't.
No worries. It's okay. Well, we're here to talk about your completed book, Lineage. Congratulations on finishing it. And I think a good place for us to start our conversation is with a fundamental question. What are family history and genealogy, and what do these terms and practices mean to us today?
That's, of course, a fundamental question. So thanks for starting with that. I think when most people think about genealogy, they think about two things. One, they think about the contemporary practice where people are investigating their ancestry. And some people are really energetic about doing that and do tons of research and go very far back in their ancestry. And some people are just exploring their kind of immediate kin connections. And then the other thing people think about is kind of formal lineages, like those of the monarchical succession, for example. There are people who keep very close track about who will succeed King Charles III, and so on and so on and so on. But in the 18th century, people thought about genealogy somewhat differently, and I know we'll have a chance to talk about this in a really full way. I'll just say that for me, family history is really stories, like the stories that we tell one another and that we tell ourselves about our family's background. And genealogy is the practice of marking out, whether it is through telling one another through oral testimony, sometimes that happened in court, or whether through making records of our family connections. So that's how I think about it. Family history is like the stories, and genealogy is the practice of recording in a whole variety of different ways our kin connections.
I thought that was really interesting when I read Lineage, because as a historian, you had plenty of documents from people who kept family trees to figure out who's descended from whom and what other families their family shared connections with. But you also include these records that tell stories of how people used oral histories. And they often weren't elaborate oral histories either. Sometimes it was just, my grandmother told me that we're related to Uncle Bob. And I couldn't find this written record of that connection, but we do have this oral tradition that's passed down through my family telling me that we're related to Uncle Bob.
Yeah, I think one of the big takeaways from this book is that genealogy is not exactly a universal practice and a universal language, but that it was a kind of language that people understood and could talk to one another with and through. So that language of maybe we're related to Uncle Bob or maybe we're not, sometimes that took place in the context of somebody really trying to figure out, are we related to Uncle Bob? And sometimes that took place in the context of, we may have an economic connection and I'd like to further our conversation. And this is the grounds on which we can do that. And then, of course, there are really awful implications too. Maybe those are questions about freedom and slavery and whether Uncle Bob, in fact, his status was as an enslaved person or not. And from whom was he descended? Who was his mother? And was she free or enslaved? So there are a variety of different contexts in which that question, are we related, took place.
I think we have a sense now that the practice of keeping family histories and genealogies is centuries old. And yet you note in Lineage that we often think of genealogy and the practice of family history as modern practices. But as we've just said, your research shows that with the exception of DNA testing, people have been working at these practices for centuries. So where should we look for the origins and maybe the start date of this practice of genealogy in early North America?
Well, I think there are a couple of questions embedded in your question. And one is a question of how technology changes what we know about genealogy and how people practice genealogy. And as you said, DNA is a very recent example that I think really illuminates how genealogy as a practice adapts to and helps adapt the use of technologies. If we just think about how DNA technology is being used right now in such an incredible variety of ways, and how, for example, genealogy websites have helped law enforcement use, which is highly controversial, but nonetheless, law enforcement use of DNA to track family connections. That's a great example of how technology both adapts to genealogy and genealogy helps adapt that. And there are examples of that in the past too. Like we could talk about the 19th century and the explosion of print culture in the 19th century, which meant the explosion of local histories and printed family genealogies, which is, I think, something that in American history, people often associated with genealogy. It's those tomes that were printed mostly on the East Coast about these long family histories. So genealogy and technology kind of rode together. That always was the case. When we think about like what are the origins of genealogy, that is a really deep question because it's like, what is the origin of people thinking about ancestry? And one of my points about the particularity of British American practice is that it's really rooted in part in a Protestant religious tradition, which emphasizes the importance of genealogy, both Old Testament and New Testament genealogies. So would we say the origins of genealogy are in Old Testament moments? I'm quite confident people were thinking about their family relations before we have any kind of record of people thinking about it in that context.
Now, before we dive into specific early American practices of genealogy, you just noted that your study is deeply rooted in British North America. Rather than, say, New France, New Sweden, New Netherlands, or New Spain, why did you choose to focus on British North America and not all of early North America?
Well, as you know, Liz, I'm really committed to the idea of vast early America, that early America was a really complicated place with an incredible diversity of people and a diversity of different kinds of political, economic, social, and cultural structures. But part of being committed to vast early America, to thinking about early America in these really capacious terms, is also committing to particularity, to acknowledging when we're talking about and thinking about the particulars. For example, when people talk about early America, I'm making startle quotes here with my hand. When people talk about early America, I do think it's important that we say, are we talking specifically about a British American context? Are we talking about a French context? Are we talking about a comparative context? Are we talking about the foundationally indigenous early America? What is the particular thing, place, time that we are talking about? And in my case, I'm interested in British America in part because there is a particularity to the legal context that shapes genealogy and genealogical practice, not just what people wanted to do in terms of keeping track of their ancestry, but also what they were required to do.
I wonder if we could talk about the requirements of British American genealogy. You mentioned earlier that people were inspired by their Protestant faith to keep track of their family records. However, it also seemed that from a lineage perspective, there were legal and other reasons why people were interested in their genealogy. So why were early British Americans interested in their genealogies?
As you know, I've worked on this book for a long time, and I've worked on this book while I've had jobs that didn't have traditional academic leaves. So I've been working on it kind of in the interstices. But one of the real benefits of doing that is that I've had an opportunity to talk to lots of people about this project and get a lot of feedback. And there are so many great questions that people have asked me over time. But one of the really great questions I got was, but what about people who weren't interested in genealogy? Weren't there non-participants? Like, you've got all this great material, Karen, from people who produced all these family histories, but weren't there people who didn't? And it's probably not good enough to just say, well, the archives don't have their records. You need to say something more about that. And the thing is, there is an answer to that, which is that the kind of pervasiveness of genealogy is not just in those families who are proactive about recording their kin connections. It's also so deeply in institutional records. So you could be interested in genealogy or not, but genealogy was always interested in you, which means that wherever you lived, people were taking account of who you were connected to. Now, there are different contexts for that. If you were in a New England town, the town clerk was keeping track of birth, marriage, death records. If you were in Virginia, for example, the parish was obligated to record that same kind of information. For enslaved people, there was a really insidious calculation of recording people's relationships, particularly mothers and their children, very much less frequently mothers and fathers and their children together. So there is a way in which genealogical information is extracted from people. It is elicited from people, whether or not they feel enthused about creating that record.
Okay, so say we're a British American living in the 18th century. How should we go about tracing our family histories and lineage? How did people conduct family research in early America, which was a place with very few libraries?
So everybody who works on an earlier period of history thinks, oh, it would be so great if we just had more source material, right? We just had more records and more letters and more accounts. But it's been great to be able to find enough evidence that suggests how people went about this. So here's an example. I think, as you also know, Liz, I have been unable to stop researching on this project. So even though the book was done and in production almost a year ago, every time I go to a library, I'm looking at something. Well, yesterday I happened to be at the John Carter Brown Library where I work, and we just finished a fantastic new finding aid for some of our random manuscript materials. Really fantastic work, so people can go online and just kind of search for things. So, of course, I was doing a little quality control there and was looking for a family. And I came up immediately with two items. One was a disbound family record from a Bible, from a late 18th century Bible. Interesting. And the other was a single page testimony from a minister in Philadelphia in 1787 with a marriage record saying, I took this record of this person married this person at this date, was in the 1760s, and I took it from the church records here, and I testify to that, and here's my name, and here's the date in the 1780s that I did that. And that's the kind of thing where I've seen that repeatedly, that people are asking for someone to go and look at the records for them and tell them what was in those records. So that's one example of a pathway to information. A second is, of course, they're just asking their own relatives. They're constantly exchanging information, like their correspondence is full of these. When did, how did, who did, let me tell you about what happened with so-and-so. The third thing, of course, is what's impossible for us to capture, is that they just had deep ambient information about to whom they were related. And that we catch only glimpses of in the written record, where people will refer to someone as their cousin in passing correspondence. And it takes me a ton of work to document that, yes, in fact, they were distantly somehow related to this person. But they knew that.
As someone who has looked at thousands of records of how early Americans kept their genealogy on paper, did their paper records follow the same or perhaps a similar format? You mentioned that if you happen to be an enslaved person, you were either trying to help your family preserve their freedom, or if you were an enslaver, you wanted to know who your human property was going to descend through your family lines. So did all early Americans follow a specific legal format or a format that satisfied Protestant demands to keep a genealogy? Or did they simply keep family records in a lot of different ways and in many different formats?
A couple different ways of thinking about that. One is that, I have an Instagram account called Vernacular Genealogy, which is one of the chapters in the book where I talk about all the different formats in which genealogy appeared and all the different kinds of media, watercolor family records, which are really beautiful works of art, tiny scraps of single pages, little carefully hand-sewn family notebooks, pages tucked into an account book, objects that were passed along with information about who they came from and to whom they were given. There are just so many different ways that people shared their information about lineage and confirmed those relationships. So there's not kind of one format by which people follow that. I think if we think about like textual lineages and we think about what a lineage as in a formal genealogy looks like now, let's just stick with the example of the British royal family, because that's an easy one. If you go on Wikipedia and you look, they will give you a very formal accounting of who's related to whom and so on. And in a really loose sense, that is also true. So on the one hand, you see all these different ways and forms of people showing their family relationships, that vernacular genealogy. On the other hand, there is a kind of a standard way that people do that in text. That is, they typically account for my mother and my father. This person was married. These were my grandparents. They were married at this point. These were their children, and so on. Now, some of those could be more elaborate and some less. One of the objects that I feature in the introduction to the book is from an indigenous man. He's from Cape Cod, who was a servant during the Maine Wars in the early 18th century. And his account book had information about how he should be repaid for his service, but also a couple of tiny references to key family events, the births of his children. And those births of his children in his account book, from a really different cultural background with a really different way of accounting and thinking about family and kin, look so much like the ones that I see from standard shoemakers in the middle of Massachusetts, settlers, that you can say there is a kind of standard format in that way.
Now, while we're on the subject of family record keeping, Travis would like to know more about where early American families kept their documentation and notes about their family trees. Specifically, he'd like to know more about the role family Bibles played in maintaining family records.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the assumption when I started this project from a lot of people was that I was going to be looking at lots and lots of Bibles. And in fact, I have seen probably thousands of Bibles, disbound family record pages, so many digitized, thankfully. Thank you, libraries that digitize your material, digitized copies over time now. But truthfully, those were not the primary place. And again, this goes back to the thing we were talking about, technology and how genealogy kind of swims with technological advances, because the appearance of family histories as a kind of standard part of Bibles really is part of print history. Print explodes in the 19th century and all kinds of print becomes more available, including Bibles. So let me back up for just a minute and answer this question by saying there's a kind of a three-part story to why Bibles are important in terms of family history and why they're not the primary place where people put them. The first is that, of course, they're important in terms of how people think, that kind of Protestant emphasis, even for people who are not Protestants, but that Protestant emphasis on genealogy as being really authoritative. So the Bible is important in that way. People are mimicking in their records what's happening in all of those begats in the Old Testament, and of course, the important lineage of Jesus in the New Testament. But then secondly, family Bibles are important when Bibles are really, really rare. And that's before the late 18th century. Bibles are really expensive and they're entirely imported. There are no American Bibles until after 1780, but they're expensive and they're imported. So people who have family records in family Bibles have expensive Bibles, big, heavy ones. So the Winthrop family of Massachusetts, a founding family of Massachusetts, for example, has a very expensive, big, heavy family Bible, and there are family records in it. And there are other families that are not as fancy or rich or powerful as the Winthrops. So a family record in a Bible before the 1780s, let's say, means that someone had a really substantial Bible, an expensive one. Smaller Bibles, less expensive Bibles, which are all over the place, don't tend to hold those family records. But then starting in the 1780s, Bibles become, because they start being printed in America and because in general print becomes cheaper and just much more available, people start putting more family records into Bibles. And Bible publishers then are like, aha, you know what we should do? We should make this thing called the family record page. And they do. They start printing a family record page in Bibles starting in the very, very late 18th century. So that's when you really start to see the family record in the family Bible as a big, powerful phenomenon.
Sterling wonders about the gender dynamics in early American genealogy practices. Specifically, he'd like to know how the paternalism in early American family organization may have shaped early Americans' practice of genealogy. So would you tell us how early Americans organized their families and communities, and how this type of organization may have influenced early American practices of genealogy?
Thank you. That's a great question. So there's one kind of obvious overriding theme here, which is that early British America is highly patriarchal. It's organized around the assumption that there is a patriarchal head of household and that it is male lineages that matter. And that always pushes against the absolute reality that maternity is always easier to trace than paternity, and that women in some ways are the original genealogies because they're the ones who are giving birth to children. There is also, really importantly in the early American context, of course, and we've alluded to slavery before, but the practice of partus sequitur ventrum, what follows from the womb, and the law, and then more pervasively, the practice, even when it's not law, of enslaving the children of enslaved women means that maternity is incredibly important too. So patriarchy, with the practical implications of maternity and the legal implications of partus, mean that patriarchalism and maternity are both really important to the practice of genealogy in early America. There are other things to say about this, which is that while typically and traditionally people traced their paternal lineages, that wasn't always the case. People sometimes were really interested in their maternal lineages. Sometimes women created female-only lineages, and I recount several of those in the book, some wonderful examples of that. So there are kind of contra examples, if you will.
Now, Margaret is curious to know about the role race and ethnicity played in the way that early Americans kept family histories. She'd also like to know if there was an element of what we would now call eugenics involved in the way that people kept family histories in early America.
So eugenics isn't really a philosophy and a practice until the 19th century. But I think in the loosest sense, that idea that elites wanted to marry elites for practical reasons, if not kind of race science that develops in the 19th century and that facilitates all kinds of horror. Nonetheless, the idea that elites wanted to marry elites for economic reasons and for reasons of political power, that absolutely, of course, pertains. And maybe lurking beneath Margaret's question, too, is there a way in which elites use genealogy to try to make claims to their authority and to their exalted position in society? And that is definitely yes, absolutely yes. But, again, when I started the project, I think people thought that this book would be dominated by looking at elites and how elites were interested. There's not a lot of history of genealogy, but a very good history of genealogy in the 19th and 20th century by Francesca Morgan, who really emphasizes that genealogy was seen as a kind of form of social capital and that it was something that elites and middling strivers were interested in doing. But I'm really looking at a different picture here. I'm looking at genealogy from a different vantage, and the 18th century looks quite different. So it's not the case that genealogy is only for elites, that there's plenty of practical import and benefit, both emotional and really strategic value for people across the board, which is why people tend to be interested in it and practice it. Again, it's like this dual emotional and practical significance.
Margaret's question also made me think about some of the stories that you tell in Lineage about how men who had white families and black families, such as Thomas Jefferson, how they trace those family lines differently from one another. So could you tell us about Thomas Jefferson and his family's record keeping, and about the differences in how Jefferson traced his white family and his black family with Sally Hemings?
Yeah, it's really shocking. I mean, embedded in Margaret's question, too, is this question about how race factors in how we think about and how people practiced genealogy. And certainly Jefferson is an important case study. But to be clear, he is a case study because he reflects a practice that was relatively, I don't want to say widespread, but certainly really significant in the 18th century South, of white men who had families with enslaved Black women, coerced relationships, we presume, and also with white wives. So Jefferson is typical in that those two families, the children that he had with Sally Hemings, who was enslaved and who was his white wife's half-sister, that family, he recorded their information in what he called his farm book, where he also had information about livestock, horses, kept information about what he was growing at Monticello. So it's pretty stark and pretty shocking, frankly. to see how he records those children's names. And he records those children's names just as he does the children of other enslaved women. Whereas the children that he had with his wife, Martha Wales Jefferson, he records them in a special family record that his own mother started, actually. So the Jeffersons have a kind of very typical, I would say, of the time, interest in recording their family history, and they create those records in fairly typical places.
Now, you also have stories that I thought were empowering in Lineage, in the sense that you tell stories of women who were white and had families with Black men, or women who had been enslaved but had to earn their freedom. You talk about how these women kept genealogies to ensure that their descendants would remain free. How did these women who feared for their families' continued freedom in a world of slavery, how did they keep their family records to ensure this continued freedom?
There's so much good scholarship and honestly, so many popular writers too, writing right now about families working through the slavery and freedom divide. I think about work that's really influenced mine. Will Thomas's great work. Honor Sachs has got a project that's really fantastic. I think about Martha Jones's wonderful new family memoir, but all of them talking about how the slavery freedom divide so affected families and so affected how families thought about themselves, but how they fought for the integrity of their families and their families' freedom. So I see that really in the context of this longer and broader history of genealogy, again, as this kind of dual project that has emotional meaning for people and for their family relationships, but also has this really instrumental practice. Sometimes a coercive practice on the part of the state or other institutions, and sometimes this really powerful instrumental value to those same families. So some of the cases that I talk about are families who are arguing for their freedom on the basis of their long history of having been free and seeing individual members of their family caught back into slavery and trying to argue for their freedom. Sometimes it's in the context of women who have had children when they weren't married and their children were immediately bound out, and then the children were enslaved rather than freed at the end. So the court records are an unbelievably rich resource for family history, not just to document who's related to whom, but also to document people's efforts to articulate those family relationships and to articulate the significance of them. Some of the cases that I looked at in Virginia are enormously striking to me, in part because of what they say about how people know their family histories. So they will talk about, my grandmother was free. I know that because I knew her and she told me the story of her mother and her mother's mother. And then someone else will come in from the community and say, that's right, I knew her grandmother and I heard her say those things. Or I knew her from another neighborhood or another place. So there's like oral testimony there about the density of genealogical information that people have and that they can bring to bear on this situation.
In our modern world, we tend to privilege information that's on paper. So how did early Americans approach these oral histories as evidence, especially in freedom suits? Did they consider oral histories to carry the same weight as written histories?
So one complication with this whole book is that I say I'm talking about British America in the long 18th century, 1680 to roughly 1820, and I'm working across from Maine to Georgia, really. And a lot of what I'm talking about has bearing on the law, but the law doesn't stay exactly fixed. It has generally broad parameters, which is that even when it's not specifically the law, partus sequitur ventrum, it is the practice in the place that enslaved women's children are enslaved. Even when it is not specifically the law that someone can manumit a person, people tend to try to work around the law. So one of the challenges in this project is trying to show the broad pattern, but also be attentive to and responsible to the particularities. And in this case are there moments when people are kind of working the law, as it were? People are knowing that the law has given them, there's a window in the late 18th century Virginia when manumission becomes possible and then the window closes fast. So in that window, there's a fight about whether to allow oral testimony. So to answer your question more directly, oral testimony sometimes matters and sometimes doesn't, and people are kind of trying to navigate that. But what I see is that it always comes in. People use it and they try to make it influential.
Now, several listeners, including Marcia, inquired about whether there were differences in the ways that urban and rural families kept family histories and family trees. Did you notice any differences in how family trees appeared depending on whether the people who created them lived in urban versus a rural place?
Not necessarily urban and rural. One thing you notice in an urban environment is that the density of record keeping, because the density of the population is there, and in part the density of the record keeping on the part of ministers, for example, and county clerks. The other thing, I wouldn't say that there's enough evidence to really make this argument, but people in urban environments had ready access to paper and to small bound books and to almanacs and other kinds of things, other kinds of printed sources where they could put their family histories. Whereas people who were living in a more rural environment simply had less access to that. It doesn't mean they had no access by any means, but just less access. So that might be a divide. The more significant variation, I think, is across regions where we see different kinds of genealogical cultures develop.
Well, you know I love regional differences, Karen. So would you tell us about the different regional differences you saw? I was fascinated when I read Lineage to see the differences between New Englanders, Pennsylvanians, and Virginians, and the different ways they kept their family histories. But I also wondered if perhaps an increased literacy rate in the North versus the South accounted for some of those regional differences in genealogical practices.
Maybe this podcast is me telling you all the flaws of this book, but one of them for sure is that I'm confident that if I had chosen to focus on one region, I could have gone deeper and done a more thorough job in any one place. Like, for example, I'm proud of the book. I like the book, but I wish I'd done more with New York, where Dutch law, for example, and the way that Dutch law privileges women's inheritance practices. I can see that in the records that I have. I can see how that's influencing how there's some slightly different traditions there in family records, but I didn't do enough work there to really make it a chapter of the book. So I am confident that there is so much more to say about regional genealogical context. The other thing I didn't do is really dig into the Caribbean. And I think there's really interesting work there to be done on particularly the British Caribbean and the connection to the island Britain. But that said, some things that look really different. Any of us who think about early America know that New England is a place of towns. And we know that Virginia, my beloved Virginia, is not a place of towns. It was a place of these big, huge counties with really dispersed populations, with a few towns, important ones, like Williamsburg. But that, in some ways, is mirrored in how genealogy looks different. In New England, genealogy's family records emphasize towns, and they emphasize, like, even if a family had been living out on the Connecticut River Valley for generations, they will nonetheless emphasize, but we were originally from Milton. So there is this kind of like rootedness in a town story, and you don't see that in Virginia. People ask me if Virginia elites always emphasize their connection to Britain, and that's not necessarily a clear pattern either. That's a little bit up and down. And by the 18th century, certainly, elite Virginians were just as interested in their original Virginia origins, just like New Englanders were, than they were in their kind of British or other kinds of European origins. But a really important distinction, though, is, as always, like slavery really makes a difference. And it's not that slavery isn't existing in New England. Of course it is. And we can talk about why I don't do as much with indigenous families in this book, too. But the pervasiveness of slavery in the mid-Atlantic and further south really changes how these family records look. And I have many examples, and many more examples than appear in the book, where you see a single volume and it has a white enslaving family's lineage and then notes on enslaved families in the same space. So that's a real difference too.
Now, in your book, Lineage, you devote most of your chapters to everyday people and how they researched and recorded their family histories and lineages. But in Chapter 7, you focus specifically on the founding fathers and their interest in genealogy, and you cover many founders. So I wonder if you would discuss the efforts of both George Washington and John and Abigail Adams, so the first and second presidents, and how they went about researching and preserving their family records.
So the chapter is called Founders on Foundings, and I didn't want the book to end without addressing this key question of, didn't the American Revolution make a difference? I think when I first started this project, these many years ago, I thought, surely all these early Americans were individualistic. Why do I find examples of people being obsessed with lineage? Don't they know this is a democracy? They don't need to be interested in this stuff anymore, right? But the problem is that they really were. And once you start looking for it, you can't not see it. One of my favorite things, not to pick on Ron Chernow, but I think he can take it, but his book on George Washington literally opens with a statement about how George Washington wasn't interested in his family history. And there are a lot of great research moments that I've experienced over time, but one of the really great ones was getting to deal with this piece of Washington source material that had not been properly cataloged at the Library of Congress and had not made it into any of the papers of George Washington. And it is a document where George Washington writes on one side of this piece of paper a family tree. It's literally a family tree that begins with his great-grandfather and goes down to his little toddler nieces. And on the other side is a list of tithables, inherited enslaved people, and the tax that was owed on them. What an incredible document to really display the twinned power of genealogy. George Washington is inheriting through this line that he has sketched out the very people who were on the same piece of paper. And on that piece of paper, he writes Genealogy of the Washington Family. And he puts that on the side of the paper that is the tithables. It's a really illuminating document, let's just say. And there are other ways that George Washington was interested in his family history. Because he was the first president, and as we know from a lot of great work from scholars, including Chernow, I'll give him that credit, Europeans, especially the British, weren't really sure how to deal with him. And one thing they did was try to figure out, what's his lineage? How can we put him in an ancestral context? Because that's the governmental context that we know people. You think about who are they related to and how did they inherit their authority? So the heralds at the College of Arms in Britain, which is the body that is responsible for creating coats of arms, which were really important to distinguish one family from another in battle back in the days of Richard III and Henry VII, but has now come to be this really expert body of genealogical researchers. The guy who was the head of it, the chief herald, wrote to George Washington and said, I'm interested in American families. I have married into an American family. I want to document your family history. And Washington was like, no, I'm not that interested. And then immediately turned around and wrote to other members of his family and was like, well, you have that piece of paper and you have this. And I need you to get it to me. So this guy, Sir Isaac Hurd, was able to do quite a lot with the Washington lineage. And there are plenty of other examples. Washington was interested in using his coat of arms. He put it on lots of things. So there's a lot to say about how Washington was invested in the authority of lineage, as well as the practical benefits that it brought to him and the law of inheritance brought to him. John Adams is an interesting character because obviously he's a very different guy. He comes from a very different background. He's a New Englander. He's a lawyer. He's famously a little feisty. And he has this extraordinary partner. We know so much less about Martha Washington simply because so little survives about her. But we know a lot about Abigail Adams because a lot survives because she wrote a lot. She had a lot to say and happily it was preserved. But both Abigail and John were very interested in their family backgrounds. And Washington didn't do this, but they, like many other of their and previous generations, when they were in England, they went to visit sites of family history and they went to visit relatives and ask relatives about their lineage and how to fill out that side of the family tree. And they enjoyed that quite a lot. They, like Washington, also used family coat of arms. Adams, it was a little super faux pas that he used the coat of arms from his mother's family. That's just a not done thing. Anyway, he also put it on his carriage to ride to the inaugural. That was also a no-go. Anyway, so they're very interested, all of them. And we could just go through the founders one by one. I set myself a little challenge, like find a founder who wasn't interested in genealogy and who did nothing about their family history. And I couldn't find one. I would say, okay, I've read about this person, James Monroe. He's like at the end of this generation, right? And Happily William and Mary, where I taught for a long time, has Monroe papers. And I thought, okay, there's probably nothing in there. But there was, of course there was. And Franklin, how can we not talk about Ben Franklin? Franklin is the individual American, right? We think of him as like, he writes the autobiography, the story of me, all about me. But Franklin's autobiography begins with this story of going to England and investigating his family history with his son, and lots of accounts of all the family that he met. And Franklin comes from a line of genealogists. His uncle Benjamin was a great genealogist and left him plenty of family records. So in short, founders deeply invested in the idea of lineage and the authority of lineage.
Given how deeply invested the founders were in lineage, Stessa would like to know if the practice of genealogy influenced the United States' founding documents in any way. So Karen, why don't we take a moment to thank our episode sponsor, and then we'll come back and answer Stessa's question. If Ben Franklin's World has deepened your understanding of early America or sparked your curiosity, please consider supporting the show. We're now independently produced by Clio Digital Media, a small nonprofit I co-founded with fellow historians Joe Edelman and Karen Wolf. There's no big institution behind us. We're just a team of 3 historians with our deep love of history. Your donation is tax deductible and directly supports creation of new episodes, expert conversations, and the kind of trustworthy history that you value. If every listener gave just $5, we'd be fully funded for the year. So please visit benfranklinsworld.com/donate to make your gift. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. Thank you so much for your support and for being a part of our story. Karen, Stessa would like to know if the practice of genealogy influenced the United States' founding documents in any way, and if so, what those influences are.
Great question. I guess it depends on what you mean by the founding documents, because if we think about the founding documents as kind of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, I would say that the ideas about genealogy absolutely influence that, because the ideas that inform the practice of genealogy are these deeply rooted ideas about inheritance. I talk in the book a lot about inheritance and inheritance law and how the presumptions of the idea of inheritance really shapes how people think about property. And that really undergirds a lot of American founding principles, just this basic idea that, first of all, a person can own property, and secondly, that they can give that property and that they should give that property to the people that they're related to. Now, how do we know that they think that? Well, we know they think that because so many of the laws that if you die without making a will, then the state, that is literally, I'm talking broadly, the government, but it could be literally the state of Pennsylvania or Massachusetts or Rhode Island, or the US, will assume you've died intestate without a will, and they will give your property to the people you are most closely related to. And that is still true today. I looked up for a presentation last year, what are the laws here in Rhode Island where I live? So who's going to get my stuff if I die without a will? Of course, I'm not going to die without a will. But sure enough, there's a specific division to my spouse, to my children, in the absence of my children, to my siblings, absence of siblings, to nibblings, and it goes on from there. But in other words, this is in part why the government is always so interested in making sure they know who's related to whom, because you may not know that they need to know at some point who you're related to, but they know that they need to know. Sometimes people say, well, this seems, of course, your stuff should go to someone who you're related to. But that's not necessarily true. That isn't true the world over, and that hasn't been true always. It is a very British-style system that presumes that your stuff should go and divest in exactly this particular pattern. And some people were really critical of that whole thing. There were some real radicals at the late 18th century who were like, when you die, nobody should inherit anything. It's a much more equalitarian approach to say you die and all your stuff goes to the government and then gets redistributed. And that would be much better. We would have a much less unequal, or we would have a much more equal society if people couldn't inherit tons and tons of property. But that was controversial to say then, and it's certainly still controversial now.
Now, at the start of our conversation and in Lineage, you noted that in the early days of the early American Republic, so we're talking about, as you mentioned, the 1780s into the early 19th century, you mentioned that there was a surging print culture that promoted a lot of ideas, images, and texts that encouraged genealogical practice. So I wonder if we could discuss this surging print culture and how printers encouraged early Americans, especially in the 19th century, to keep track of their family trees.
There are a couple different ways that print culture dovetails with genealogy in a way that we might recognize it today. One is, I've already mentioned, is the family record page at the back of these new American Bibles. Wow, there are a lot of them. And the family record page has a pretty standard format for births, marriages, and deaths, even has fairly standard illustrations for that. Sometimes they echo gravestone symbology. So that's one, is just in that kind of repository. The other is that the profusion of publications of local histories and then family histories, beginning really in the 1820s and then in the 1830s and forward. So printed family histories, printed genealogies in the 18th century, they're really just a vanishingly small number of extant family histories that are printed, maybe less than 10, surely. And interestingly, most of those are associated with people who were printers themselves. And most of them are just like tiny, maybe 1 page or 2 page. There are a couple that are little kind of pamphlets in the 18th century that look more like these 19th century long things. But the long family histories that get published in the 19th century are also related to the organizations that start to form historical societies, genealogical societies, the New England Historic and Genealogical Society being among the first, which is now called American Ancestors. And that kind of organizing impulse combines with the ability of printers to produce a lot relatively cheaply. And there you go. You've got a phenom.
Karen, you have been working for years to bring Lineage to life. Now that your book is in its final form and it's published, what are you most excited about? What do you hope readers will take away and better understand from your work?
Well, I've already told you my regrets, like not enough New York, and and I have other regrets too. Like one of the joys of working on this for such a long time is I've been able to talk to so many people about it. And I was worried that I would forget to thank someone. And sure enough, I did. A quite important one. I just want to say I have a beautiful example in this book of a fantastic watercolor family record from Newbury, Massachusetts. That was something that the great scholar of 18th century religion, Doug Winiarski, pointed out and sent to me years ago. And I only know it because of Doug. I mean, maybe I would have stumbled upon it eventually. And I don't credit Doug in here. I feel terrible. Anyway, so I feel like I want to go through every copy of the book and add to the footnote, thank you to Doug Winiarski. Okay, so there's regrets. But what am I excited about? I guess mostly I'm excited to talk to people about it, just like this. And I'm going to get to go do some events. And it's really fun to talk to people about their ideas about what family history means. After a long career thinking and reading and teaching about early America, it remains something important to me to say that family history is probably the most capacious, and I'm always in favor of capacious, but the most capacious way that we can think about the past. Family history, I think it's put off to the side as a kind of marginal topic, but no, it is right at the center. It's at the center of politics. It's at the center of the economy. It's at the center of people's experience. So why wouldn't we talk about that more? And the opportunity to encourage people to do that and to think about that, even in this way, thinking about the history of a phenomenon like genealogy is very exciting to me.
So it's really the most everyday way that we can talk about everyday experiences.
Yes, absolutely. And even more than everyday experiences, it's like structural stuff too, because family history is very much about these structures of law that require certain kinds of things of family relationships and elicit certain things of family relationships. So it's everyday experience, but it's also these kind of broad structures that shaped people's experience.
Now, Karen, I know you're a big fan of the time warp, but I also know that you've been thinking very deeply about the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. So I thought our next segment should be 1776 in context, which, in fairness, is the segment that you gave me the idea for. So, as we're in the midst of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, in your opinion, what role or roles do you think genealogy and family history have played in the creation and the continuation of the American Revolution and the new United States?
Big question. So not everybody has a happy or cozy family experience, even when we can say that we know that everyone is born into some kind of family relationship. That is, that everyone is born of someone. But I think that the way that family relationships and people's ambitions for their family relationships and people's ideas about family relationships are a really enduring part of the American story. Whether you think about conflicts over what families should look like, whether you think about people's kind of desires for their children or efforts to care for their parents or worries about their communities, family is really this kind of foundational place where we rest a lot of our assumptions about what has gone before and what should come next. That's in part why I think it's so important to think about the history of family. Too often we think about what is my own experience of family, or we think about what are policies that are shaping family. But family is a really big category of both experience and political structure that is really worth our energy. Certainly was very important in the original founding, and it remains so today.
That was a great answer. And I'll be honest, I thought you were either going to go really large with your answer, as you just did, or discuss how the child United States split away from Mother England during the Revolution and make a family metaphor out of it.
I could have done metaphor. I thought about doing Nathaniel Barber, who I can't believe, I think I left his Bible out of the book because I've done something else with it. But that Bible is mind-blowing because Nathaniel Barber, he's a son of liberty. He's like right on the Liberty Bowl, the silver Liberty Bowl that Revere made. And his family Bible is amazing. He writes about his wife dying because the British, during the occupation of Boston, they're leaving Boston. She's sick and she dies very soon after. And he says, it's them. They killed my wife. But the two of them also have these children that they name little Oliver Cromwell Barber and Catherine Macaulay Barber and John Wilkes Barber. Like they're really political. And that family Bible is amazing as a revolution-centric document.
Before we conclude, I know we keep emphasizing this, but you've been working on Lineage for a long time. And as you mentioned, you're still engaged in some research for this project. So what kind of project or projects are you working on now, Karen?
Too many things, which is, of course, always fun. I mean, I have a bunch of different projects going. I'm doing several projects that are letting me kind of dive deeper on things that I was interested in Lineage, but that I didn't have time or space to do in the book. One of them, for example, sounds really dry, but stay with me, which is, I talk in the book about William Blackstone, the great 18th century jurist, who is still referenced today, his great commentaries, a real kind of composite of the English common law that influenced a lot of early American lawyers and lawmakers. And right at the center of Blackstone is this whole genealogical project, because Blackstone's work is fundamentally about property and how property gets inherited. And he was a professor. He wanted to teach his law students how to think about genealogy. So he had made this huge family tree of this fictional family, the Stiles family. And he wrote long, long things about the Stileses and their relationships. So one of the things I've been working on is how editions of Blackstone come into British America and then get adapted or adopted. I mean, the astonishing thing is that they're adapted very little and they have influence for a really long time. So that's a thing I'm really interested in. And then another kind of related piece, another kind of spin-off of the book is I'm really interested in single moms who were giving court testimony. There's a moment in late 18th century Massachusetts where the law changes in the way that they can give testimony to get paternity support for their children. And I'm really interested in this question about when these young women, they're almost all quite young, go to court to name the fathers of their babies, how that is the creation of a kind of family history in and of itself. So those are two things, but there's more. There's always more.
If we have more questions about genealogy and family histories in early America, where can we get in touch with you?
I'm pretty easy to find. I have a website, KarenWolf.com, where I publish a lot of these tidbits of things that I can't stop researching. I am on social media. You can find me at Vernacular Genealogy on Instagram, and I'm on Blue Sky. But I'm also really easy to find by email and my Brown University email address. It's Karen_Wolf@brown.edu.
Karen Wolf, thank you so much for your continued support and help with Ben Franklin's World, and for helping us better understand the history of genealogy and family history in early America.
Thank you, Liz. And thank you for being such a great reader and supporter of this project all along.
Genealogy was far more than a curiosity in British North America. It was a powerful tool. As Karen revealed, tracing family connections allowed people to claim rights, assert freedoms, and navigate the social and legal worlds of their time. For early Americans, genealogy was emotional and strategic. It was also intimate and institutional, as it often shaped the very structure of families and communities. As Karen demonstrated, genealogy wasn't confined to elite white men. It was practiced by people across colonial British America's social, racial, and geographic lines. From family Bibles and oral traditions to legal petitions and community memory, early Americans found countless ways to preserve and protect their lineages. For free families of color, preserving lineages could often mean the difference between a life in bondage or a life in freedom. For the founders, lineages affirmed legitimacy and status. And for everyone else in between, knowing and keeping family histories was a means to making meaning out of the past in service of the present and future. Like history, genealogy has the power to tell us who we are, which is why we shouldn't be surprised that even though we think of genealogy as a modern-day practice, in reality, it's a centuries-old practice used by early Americans and people before them to help make sense of their past, present, and future. You'll find more information about Karen, her new book, Lineage, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/416. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. If you enjoy the stories and insights we share on Ben Franklin's World, please consider supporting the podcast. Your tax-deductible donation helps us produce new episodes, keeps the show independent, and brings you history that's both trustworthy and engaging. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/donate to make your gift today. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Ademan, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, do you engage in genealogy? If so, how has this episode and knowing about the early American history of genealogy made you think about your work? I'd really love to know. I don't practice genealogy personally, so I'd love to learn from your experiences. Let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com.